The U.S. Constitution and Race, Three Founding Points of View. This is really the first lecture within this section for those of you who have chosen racism as a form of legal injustice. I would appreciate if you thought about this over the course of this semester and revisit this lecture later in this coming semester. The cases that link to this lecture are Scott versus Sanford, Plessy versus Ferguson, and Brown versus Board of Education. Those are in the Law and Identity Reader, and they're excerpts, so they've been edited by myself to get kind of down to what's called the dicta, the main point of the legal opinion. If you want to read the full cases, I use the Legal Information Institute at Cornell. And you might think about also reading Terry versus Ohio and trying to put some perspective on kind of the Black Lives Matters movement, policing injustice, and some of these big questions that are coming up amongst white supremacy advocates, nationalists, and people who are trying to think about these issues from their lived experience and try to map that with some of the logic that's coming from these cases to try to see if you can come up with a narrative that goes from, say, 100 years before the founding of the United States up to today to kind of a better idea of how we are where we are. So there's a worksheet that you can use alongside of this, and I'm just trying to get you to think about these main questions for each slide. So this is really just an introduction to this topic. I don't intend for this to be the only statement on the matter. And I have other videos that you can watch that go along with this one. And I will be doing 2 more videos in this sequence. So you want to kind of what we're really trying to get is, what are these 3 different perspectives? And I chose these 3 people mainly because of how outspoken they were. And so when folks kind of talk about the quote-unquote founding fathers, it seems like they're almost always painting with a very heavy brush and saying that somehow they spoke with one voice. So I wanted to pull out 3 voices that are very different from each other in the content of what they're saying. And then just try to understand at the same time, right, that these are 3 white men, and that they have the power in this situation. So it's very much white men in a white man's world. And we want to get a better idea of what is this underlying philosophy. And so there's 2 perspectives I want you to consider. One is natural philosophy. In other words, our natural rights, like equality, do not need to be written down to make them true. We're all born free and equal in nature, right? And so you kind of have to use your imagination here a bit, because what they're really getting at here is that for thousands of years, human beings are free in nature. It's only when we enter into social agreements, into governments, into societies, that we become unfree. And this is different than the positivist philosophy, which is saying not really the opposite of that, but just a totally different way of thinking about it, which is nothing is really a right until it's written down. And so this is more of like mutually agreed upon social norms, if you learn that in Intro to Criminal Justice. So that's a positivist point of view. It's not the only point of view. It's not even really the dominant point of view at this time, right, in the 1700s. It becomes dominant during World War II in the 1930s. And I think just from conversations I have with non-lawyers, is that this seems to be the most widely disseminated or shared kind of information. And I guess it makes sense. When you're a kid or whatever and you're learning about how a bill becomes a law, they tend to focus pretty consistently on Congress. But at the same time, I hear from students in other classes, that they don't think Congress does anything, that they think they're corrupt. And I think those are two widely shared opinions. And so there must be more to law than that. And of course there is. But that knowledge doesn't seem to get passed to people outside of law school and then various select areas of PhD school. So I wanted to try to provide that information so that folks can kind of see what the difference is and why it matters. And then I want to end with some just kind of big thoughts. And I might preface this by another reading that I think you'll probably want to do in this section is Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, which really comes from a larger publication called Why We Can't Wait. And this is his argument that really not much has changed in the 1950s and 60s. And so I'm kind of continuing that argument that sure, things have changed, right? There's changes that we can kind of document, but the underlying racism, which I think is pretty evident, at least if you're watching media, of kind of the protests and police encounters that you've seen over the last 30, 40, 50, 100, 200 years. I think it kind of does beg this question, like what has really changed? Like if there are changes, what are those things? But first we want to just kind of go back in time. So the three people that we're looking at are James Wilson, George Mason, and John Adams, and they are very different people. I think one thing that gets lost on students if they haven't taken a American government class with somebody who is knowledgeable and appreciates state constitutions, and that state constitutions came long before the United States Constitution, the federal Constitution. And understanding that, these three men, for example, all come from, what would be called Great Britain, right? So England, Scotland, Ireland. And so I think, there's this legacy that's continuing of self-government from those places that is not true at the time, or even that historical period of France, of Germany, of Spain, of Portugal. And so these folks are different when they're thinking about politics. And they're coming from kind of a cultural point of view that's very different than I think even the modern time within the United States. And I think, these kind of gross generalizations that people make about the founders or this country being this or that, that's what I mean. I mean, you see the evidence of it when, these three people were very different, but they spoke obviously the same language. They had more or less the same views of religion. And they were used to a certain way of life that was, intergenerational, passed down to them from their great-grandparents and whatnot. But they're also the quote-unquote leaders or the framers or the founders of their state constitutions. So James Wilson is coming from Pennsylvania, which is kind of, if I could call it such, a classic colony. It's founded with William Penn as the governor. It's very much kind of a carbon copy of what self-government would look like in England from the historical record. If we look at the speeches, we look at the writings, if we look at just the way that they organized their government. And James Wilson in particular follows that kind of pattern of being the most educated leader, as the lawyer, as the one who's kind of the legal mind, right? The person who Pennsylvania is looking to talk about law. Whereas like Ben Franklin is representing a very different point of view. So you kind of see like this kind of pattern in much of the Northeast, in New York, to some extent in New Jersey, but definitely in Connecticut, Rhode Island, etc. So he later becomes a Supreme Court justice, which is not shocking. And he's a framer of the United States Constitution, meaning that he's very much involved in the drafting, the design of the United States Constitution. And he decides to be a defender of what's called Article 1, Section 9, which is the slave trade clause. This is where Congress is this is where the framers of the Constitution give Congress the power to, the explicit enumerated power, the written down power, to end the slave trade in the United States. But they make a bit of a compromise, saying that this will happen in 1808, which is the time period, which doesn't really happen. and there's a war with England going on at that time, as well as other wars. Um, so his argument, as you'll see, is kind of based on this idea that Congress should be the place where slavery is banned. Um, and we'll see whether that's a legitimate point of view or if he really meant it. George Mason, on the other hand, is like a classic Southern, quote unquote, gentleman. And, he's a member of this group that descended from the Virginia Trading Company charter. And so Virginia was not in any way mirrored after the self-government of England. It was set up as a corporation, which is kind of strange for people to think about, except for if I start bringing up, maybe last year, the example of Jeff Bezos and Amazon possibly coming to New York, and then the huge political argument over it. And largely what New York council members and legislative folks were saying was they didn't want New York to become basically owned by Jeff Bezos and Amazon. And I'm recording this lecture in Seattle, Washington, where there are parts of Seattle where you go to, and it really does feel like it's a corporate place. It's not. It doesn't feel like it's separate from Amazon. And even the protests that are going on in Seattle are relatively far away from the Amazon areas. And so you kind of see this like interesting pattern that develops in the United States, where corporations have personages, right? They're treated as persons, and yet Africans are treated as slaves. And so you've got this very blatant contradiction, really right in the middle of the American East. And so we need to try to understand that a bit more, because that's I think what the more blatant side of racism that we see in the United States. So the history of this that I think gets lost a lot of the time is that these folks of the so-called new aristocracy, or what we commonly say is new money, who set up these plantations, were kind of like rejected or ejected from England. And they were the rogue families that lost in the English Civil War. And so they were suddenly, they were, I don't want to say that they were like second-class citizens. They were not powerless, but they weren't as powerful. So it'd be like, Republican Democratic parties, right? Like at one time, one is more powerful than the other. And I'll let you guess which one's more powerful now. So they're from the slightly less powerful group after they lose the Civil War, and they're suddenly given basically freedom, right? The complete liberty to do whatever they want in the South, in Virginia. And so you're going to see his point of view as a legacy of slavery, right? So he's not inventing slavery, he's benefiting from slavery. So I'd like you to think about that as white privilege. How do white folks, including myself, benefit from racism, and how these social relationships are kind of formed out of that oppression and that powerlessness. And then you want to think about, how did George Mason and other privileged white males frame the Virginia State Constitution in such a way where Mason can later vote against the United States Constitution, and feel comfortable that folks in Virginia would basically be saying, setting the stage for the future when they're going to secede from the Union and say they have the right to private property, including slaves. So very different kind of point of view than James Wilson. And then I think somebody who doesn't get really enough attention is John Adams. And this one, I think, is when people talk about democracy with a small d, they're usually talking about this idea of self-government as a group of people who get to decide what the rules are going to be, what values that they have, what a crime is going to be, jury trials galore, right? Like jury trials for everything. And really this kind of proactive, civil, almost religious sense of participation, that everybody's going to participate, that everybody has rights, that they're all equal. They're really coming from this concept of Massachusetts as a colony and then a commonwealth, right? Massachusetts being notorious, right, for the Boston Tea Party, for saying they have the right to self-government, that they have the right to govern themselves, and that they've proved that they can do it. So, unlike Wilson and Mason, Adams is more of an academic scholar, and as he becomes the second president of the United States, he gets to try out a lot of his knowledge that he got from ancient Greece, from the Romans, and from Great Britain, is a lot of the contemporary writings that were going on at the same time. Now, he said a lot of things against slavery, as any natural rights legal philosopher of the time would, because slavery is obviously a violation of natural law. In other words, if we're all free and equal, then enslaving another human being is by definition a violation of that law. And as many of these philosophers said, no matter what God you believe in, slavery is repugnant or disgusting or shameful, right? So it's a religious issue and it's a natural issue, right? So it's kind of this wedding of those two ideas. And then so this is where he becomes an advocate of a gradual elimination of all slavery. So on the one hand, he's vehemently against the idea of slavery, but on the other hand, he's insecure or fragile in his opinion of how that should be dealt with. And so when we end with Audre Lorde's quote, I want you to think of John Adams, right? Because I think a lot of time we say, okay, like James Wilson, he's the bad guy. He's writing in the slave trade clause in the Constitution. George Mason, he's the bad guy. He's a slave owner. And he says some things against slavery, but he's holding on to slavery, and he makes it possible for Virginia to keep holding slaves. But then you hear people say, oh, but John Adams is the good guy. So I might, put in a comment here that I don't think there are any good guys in this story. And I want you to kind of come back to John Adams maybe being even more dangerous and problematic as a social figure, because he takes a public stance against slavery, but then doesn't participate in the dismantling of that institution. And so there seems to be a contradiction here between this idea of social government, of people working together, and yet he's notably absent from this conversation. So starting with James Wilson, I'll read each of these quotes aloud. So with respect to the clause restricting Congress from prohibiting the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, the honorable gentleman says that this clause is not only dark, but intended to give to Congress the power to admit the importation of slaves. His argument now turns. He says a tax or duty not exceeding $10 for each person operates as a partial prohibition. Yet it will produce the same kind gradual change which was pursued in Pennsylvania. I'll leave it to your logic class, if you take that either here at Kingsborough or later on in your life, in philosophy, to see this is not a strong argument. And I'll show you why. We start off with the end where he's saying, we, quote unquote, right, he's from Pennsylvania, we had a kind, and I assume he means like in kind, right, similar, gradual change in Pennsylvania, meaning they did not free slaves overnight, but that they took a long approach. And when asked about this, he said that it was because of the people, right? The people decided they were against slavery, so then the legislature made it illegal. But he's making this comparison of Pennsylvania to all 13 colonies with full knowledge that Virginia and the other South slave-owning states do not share this point of view. So I think if we accuse him not quite of lying, but at least of stretching or exaggerating his point here, I think that's the weakness in his argument, that this doesn't apply to all 13 colonies. And so it's a bad analogy to compare what might happen with 13 colonies to what did happen in Pennsylvania. And so you see this is much more of a legal argument than a historical argument or a philosophical argument. So then we want to see, what is his argument? So his argument is really getting to this idea that, by putting a fine in 1808 of $10 for every slave that you import, right? So that doesn't include any of the slaves that you presently own or any of the children that those slaves produce. So the idea is, if you have enough money, you'll pay this fine and you'll bring in slaves. But if you don't have enough money, or I guess, if you think that you can make money a different way, then you won't import slaves. This is, in law, we would say speculative, right? There's no reason, evidence, there's no statistics, there's nothing supporting this idea that this is going to happen. If you know, right, in 1808, from 1787. So he's really predicting the future here by a long ways. And it's interesting because you can start to get the idea of what folks like him are trying to do. They really are trying to shift slavery from having folks purchase slaves or enslaved peoples from the Atlantic African slave trade, in other words, already enslaved people, to the idea that somehow they will be produced within the United States. And so maybe they'll only be, quote unquote, bred in Virginia or Georgia, but in Pennsylvania there will be no slaves. Now, this doesn't seem likely, right? So it's hard to really gauge this argument. All I can say about this argument is that he's saying this convention, the folks at this convention, represent both the North and the South, people who are against slavery, people who are very much for slavery, and this is the compromise that they came up with. And so, in his mind, the folks that said a $10 fine for each slave imported might make slavery less economically beneficial, doesn't seem to be based on any concrete reason. Which leads me to George Mason, who's making an interestingly deceitful argument here as well, where he says the Western people, in my opinion, the Western people are already calling out for slaves for their new lands. And here he's meaning like Missouri, moving out that way. Not like the West, but like the Midwest at this point. And so basically he says, look, this is a fact, basically. People want slaves. And then he kind of switches positions. But slavery discourages the arts and manufactures. So the poor despise labor when performed by slaves, meaning the poor don't like the fact that there are slaves performing work that perhaps they could do for money or a higher wage. The second argument is they prevent the immigration of whites who really enrich and strengthen the country. To me, that sounds blatantly racist. They produce the most pernicious effects on manners, also racist and a little confusing. In other words, saying that because slaves don't act gentlemanly, then that's going to have a negative effect, say, for kids who are watching. And then every master born of slaves is a petty tyrant. So he has slaves, so I guess in some way he's speaking from experience. He feels like a tyrant. And they bring the judgment of heaven on a country. The general government should have the power to prevent the increase of slavery. So he's saying at the end of there that, because it is a sin, because it is religiously wrong, because it is against natural philosophy, there will be a punishment at some point. And so therefore the government, Congress, should end slavery. So there's a lot going on there, obviously, right? And he's, voting against the Constitution. So I think some interpretations that I've heard, right, is that his argument is that slavery is bad in and of itself, that you don't need the Constitution to make that point. So in some ways he sounds like a natural philosopher, but he's a plantation owner, and he is a slave trader, right? And he has slaves, and so and he's got 9 kids. So his entire economic well-being is based in the slave trade. So if the slave trade were to end, he would suddenly become poor. And he's not willing to do that. So he's arguing on the one hand that morally slavery is wrong. However, there are economic considerations to think about before you ban the evil practice. Then we have John Adams, who This is a collection of different statements that I put together from a book that looks at the historical point of view of the slave trade in the United States. So he says, if the gangrene of slavery is not stopped, the calamities of slavery is likely to produce an insurrection of blacks against the whites. I like the beginning of the sentence, and I pretty much hate the ending of it. If the gangrene of slavery is not stopped. I think that's an interesting metaphor, right? It's got a beautiful picture of what slavery is, right? So he's saying the first problem with the slave trade is the fact that it exists, right? That is the wound. That is the wound that one group of humans have inflicted on another group of humans. And again, he's an academic scholar looking at history, and slavery has been around, sadly, for thousands of years. So he's commenting on this general problem of men, that they engage in this warfare, they enslave folks, and then they sell people to further pay for more warfare and more slavery. And so it's this ongoing cycle. But he's worried that the way that will remedy itself, right, if white folks don't do something about it, is that there'll be black violence against white people. So he says all possible humanity should be shown consistent with public safety. So he's saying, on the one hand, almost, right, he's almost saying that there's a justification for violence against white folks. Although he uses the word insurrection and not civil war, not revolution, right? So he's not making quite the comparison to what the colonists are saying to England, and saying that they want to be free. So he then goes on to consider this idea that whites should try to be humane, but that it needs to be considering public safety, or what he sees as this threat of insurrection. Now he contradicts himself in a different writing. He says 99 out of 100, meaning slaves, would ultimately ask their old masters to care for them again. Again, in law we'd call this speculative. I mean, there's no evidence of this. It's hard, using our 21st century brains, to believe that this is true. So let me try to give John Adams the benefit of the doubt. In the 1750s, 60s, 70s, up to the 1850s, we're talking about plantations that are hundreds, if not thousands, of miles away from any other place where folks could kind of what we'd call a city, where you have transportation, communication, etc. So if I'm a slave and I'm freed, but I'm in the middle of nowhere, Virginia, his point is, am I likely to set out and walk all those miles on the hopes that I'm going to find some way of living, not knowing if there's a racist group of folks like the KKK ready to kill me, not knowing whether someone's going to come after me because I'm technically their property under the law, not knowing whether I'm going to be accepted in any of the other places that I go. You could start to think that that's true. However, again, with our 21st century brains, we know that folks organized the Underground Railroad, for example, and that other folks, did walk and walk and walk and walk for their freedom. So I think that the judgment we'd have on John Adams here is that don't underestimate the power of freedom, that people want to be free. I'd also say, in criticism of his other comment, is don't underestimate the power of people to be peaceful, to be free and peaceful. And so, I think his worries here are both out of place. But the reason I pulled these is because I want you to see how similar they are, especially as this political campaign starts going forward, in the rhetoric that folks use even today. So he says, many would gather into criminal bands, roaming the countryside and terrorizing society. So if you think of Hillary Clinton's terrible phrasing of super predators, um, this kind of what's called dog whistle politics, where they say one thing but they mean something racist, um, law and order, um, a danger to society. I mean, these kind of gross generalizations that are not based in fact or reality, but that are meant to be used as arguments to exercise caution in trying to bring about equality. So again, I'd probably compare that to Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where he's saying the wait has been long enough, right? Being treated in an inhuman way should be remedied immediately, not over time. And I think when Adams says, only a few of the most thinking and philosophical among them would seek subsistence by their own labor, yeah. I mean, that is based in pure racist ideology, right? The idea that somehow skin color is going to change folks' ability to learn how to take care of themselves um, is madness, especially considering 2 points. One, that most of the enslaved folks um, were the losers of war. Um, so you're not talking, you're talking about people who went into a battle and lost. You're not talking about people who weren't capable of taking care of themselves. But secondly, it is insane to suggest that someone can work for you, that they can labor for you, but they can't work or labor for themselves. As somehow they get confused when the food is for themselves. This is just not correct. And it's a strange way of phrasing this. But I think, at the end, Adams says something that I basically hear most white folks saying today. I cannot comprehend this object. I must leave it to you. They're just saying, I can't solve this problem. I don't know the answer. Rather than take the time to actually think through it and have conversations about it and enter into the political process. So they benefit from it, but they don't see any need to engage in a dialogue around it. So you kind of see the contradictions in each point of view. So now I want to provide some context and interpretation. What I call this a structural historical, and if you're interested in this way of interpreting, especially the law, you'd want to look up a French philosopher named Michel Foucault, Foucault. And especially if you transfer to the four-year college, you might want to start engaging with this particular theory in relation to crime. But what we're looking at here is the structures, which are the norms of the institution. So the rules that the institution of slavery puts through, the rules that the Congress puts through. In other words, the suggestions of how we should all be living. And then the historical, which I'm using this idea of ideas and the power relation. So who gets to set up the ideas, right? So if I'm in power and then I tell everybody this is the way that we think, we're all individualists, blah, 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 then the powerless are not going to be likely to try to resist that publicly or with me, in a confrontational way. And so we're looking at this and trying to get a better understanding. What's the context here of these three men and their point of views about slavery? So I think that this is an interesting hypothesis. This comes from a historian, and so it'd be interesting to try to think about this even today. So slavery is a mode of compulsion and has often prevailed where land is abundant. So I think the argument that I've heard people give is that slavery is a necessary evil, but in fact it's really not. It's a choice that some groups of people make when they quote unquote need slave labor to take care of all this land that they otherwise couldn't take care of. Now, for me, the obvious answer to that should be, well, then you don't need all that land. But I guess what they're trying to get at here is that the economic situation is this. If I buy thousands of acres of land, I have the expectation that I'm going to get a profit from those thousands of acres of land. And it's cheaper to buy slaves than it is to pay labor. And so if you look down below this, a 5-year contract for an Englishman costs 1,000 pounds of tobacco, meaning I pay 1,000 pounds of tobacco to the person who is trading the slaves, versus a lifetime contract for an African is 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of tobacco. Now, there's the footnote that you have to say 50% of the slaves are going to die within the first 5 years. But now you can kind of see what's going on here, I think, right? If I buy an African enslaved human for 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of tobacco, I can, quote unquote, breed those slaves. So even if they die within the first 5 years, I could get 2 or 3 additional slaves for no additional cost to the slave trader. Whereas in the 5-year contract, there's more of a gamble there. There's more of a risk because I have to make sure that I do that within 5 years. The other person, I can wait. They're not on a 5-year contract. They're on a lifetime contract. So you see that simple structure of economic choice there makes it more beneficial for a white man to buy an African than for a white man to pay another white man. And so this is like what I would start to consider as the economic basis for white privilege. This is what really matters, right? When we're talking about racism, it's not enough to talk about prejudice or feelings that people have. We're talking about money, cash, that people are getting for being racist. And probably more concretely, right, the money that they're saving by being racist. And so there's kind of a double economic impact there. And then, the basis for this was learned. So the Spanish kind of start this process of taking slaves across the Atlantic, as Columbus, etc. But when the Dutch took over from the African slave trade from the Portuguese, right, they started running that system. This provided kind of 2 things for these quote-unquote rogue Englishmen. One is, basically there's already ships. There's already people going back and forth carrying slaves. So all you have to do is go to the port and buy some slaves and then take those slaves to your property. So I could go to, say, Kingston, Jamaica, purchase some slaves, and then take them back to Charleston, to take them back to Virginia. And so this is obviously much cheaper than having to be the Dutch who are paying for the ships, who are paying for that entire transportation, for paying for food, etc. And so it almost becomes like a defense in American terms, where they're saying, well, we didn't start the slave trade. We're benefiting from it. And so you see that's a very subtle argument, but it turns out to be very powerful, where it allows white people to say the next step, which is, well, it's only the Southerners who are benefiting from the slave trade, when that's not true, right? They're getting cheap tobacco products, and then later they get cheap cotton, which we still get today, right? If you see Michelle Alexander's new Jim Crow, or the documentary The 13th, is that we have largely African-American populations working for free in prisons, making products out of cotton. So again, not much has changed in this economic base. Attitudes may have changed or may not, but the economics of it still seems to be much the same. And so the way you get around that is by not, quote-unquote, making a slave, but by purchasing a slave. And so this is like this very consumer-minded idea that I'm only participating in, racial capitalism. So what can I really do about that is really kind of where I think white people end the conversation most times. And then what is, I think, the gruesome, awful reality of what makes the American slave trade worse morally is from tobacco, where there's actually a large plurality, if not a majority, the numbers are disputed here, of white folks that are also working alongside African slaves, cultivating tobacco, which is a much easier farming process than sugar being the most difficult, and cotton being also fairly difficult, and the conditions are worse. So because of the difficulty of the gardening, of the farming, the slave owners took on the ideology or the idea that they had to be more brutal, that they had to be more violent. And according to their letters, it was easier to be violent to someone who had already experienced the violence of being enslaved than it was of having to turn a free person into a slave. And so, to me, again, this seems like an argument after the fact, right? You buy somebody, they're already enslaved, you treat them poorly, and you say, well, they're already used to it, so I can do this. It's shows how far the rhetoric of argument can go when it leaves that natural philosophy of like moral obligation. So I wanted to kind of just end on two ideas. I think now you should see the difference that makes the difference between natural law and positive law. In natural law philosophy, slavery is wrong, is wrong, is wrong, is wrong, is illegal, right? There's no justification at all for it. In positive law, there's all sorts of excuses. There must have been 10 different excuses in those 3 quotes from those 3 men. And then the positive law thing I really want you to get is that the audacity to say something like this: there was no law to prevent any planter in Virginia from importing slaves. You might, and the reason I put migrating is because that's what it says in the Constitution. So you could see somebody saying the same thing, like, there's no law preventing me in Washington State or in New York State from migrating undocumented immigrants and forcing them to move to work for me. And there certainly isn't, right? It'd be incredibly difficult to make a law like that. So, in fact, you've got Article 1, Section 9 allowing it, as long as you're willing to pay $10 a head. So, what this is missing, right, is, sure, there's no positive law. That's what it really should say. There's no positive law, meaning Congress or the legislature has not passed a bill writing down that slavery is illegal. But it is a violation of morals. It is a violation of, quote unquote, God's law. It is a violation of 200 to 500 years of what's called the common law. So it is a violation of law within the institution of law. It's just not a violation of this particular area of law. So it's kind of like saying, there's no contract law that applies here, but ignoring the fact that there could be a criminal law, there could be a civil law, there could be a health law, right? There could be other ways of thinking about this. And so this is what positive law kind of allows people to do in their interpretation, is it says, well, I'm going to pick the words that benefit me. I'm going to pick the laws that benefit me. And I'm kind of going to ignore these larger issues. So I wanted to make sure you understand that, because there's like micro and macro going on there. There's the small and the big, the part and the whole. So positive law is only a part of law as an institution. And we'll be learning way more about that as we go on. So then I want to just kind of end with 2 quotes that I think make this clear. One coming from 1846 and then one from 1984. And Audre Lorde is quoted to regularly today. So I wanted to kind of end here to think about these 2 arguments that people of color are making to white people. Right? So in both of these presentations, one, Frederick Douglass is talking to a church, and this is a speech he gave a number of times, both in England and in the northeast of the United States. And then Audre Lorde is giving this to a room full of academics who are saying that they are against racism. But in both cases, you're seeing white people practice racism while saying that they're against it. So Frederick Douglass says, every Sunday some 10,000 pulpits belched forth a simultaneous lie. O Lord, we thank thee that we live in a land of civil and religious liberty. There was not a word of truth in it. 3 million souls and not a Bible. A land of civil and religious liberty. 3 million denied the privilege of marriage. 3 million exposed on the auction block to be sold like brutes. 3 million people stripped of every right and denied every privilege. Where for a man to lift up his voice in bold denunciation of slavery was to expose himself to death in 13 states of the American Union. Was this the land of civil and religious liberty? And then Audre Lorde, who's, again, in a speech, no less, making these points. And what does it mean in personal and political terms when even the 2 black women who did present here were literally found at the last hour? What does it mean when the tools of a racist patriarchy are used to examine the fruits of that same patriarchy? It means that only the most narrow parameters of change are possible and allowable. Now we hear that it is the task of women of color to educate white women in the face of tremendous resistance. As to our existence, our differences, our relative roles, and our joint survival, this is a diversion of energies and a tragic repetition of racist, patriarchal thought. For women, the need and desire to nurture each other is not pathological, but redemptive, and it is within that knowledge that our real power is rediscovered. Only within that interdependency of difference and non-dominant strengths, acknowledged and equal, can the power to seek new ways of being in the world generate, as well as the courage and sustenance to act where there are no charters. Charters meaning constitutions, laws, written bills, etc. I'll let that just sit with you and you can kind of reread it to yourself. But I think the point that I'm getting from this, as we study this particular form of legal injustice together, is there needs to be dialogue among folks who can express their differences in a safe space and who can engage in this very difficult emotional process of making actual change. And that if we are too afraid to step out of these institutions, out of these norms, out of these rules, out of these processes, then we won't be making much change. So when I ask the question, how much change have we really made? It's been limited, because even in these protests that you're possibly watching on TV, they're very different depending on where you're at in the country. And by and large, this is a small percentage of people that are participating. Most people are either making derogatory comments on social media or are keeping silent. And so we are still living under those same racist institutions because this issue has not been dealt with in a real, fundamental way. And so in order to make that change, we have to engage in what Audre Lorde is talking about as the interdependent nature of difference, meaning we need each other, right? So you see much more of a social argument similar to the one that John Adams is making, but rather than simply putting up one's hands and saying, I don't know what can be done, she's saying there must be something to be done. And so I think if we compare that to Frederick Douglass, then we're saying that it cannot simply be a religious issue. It cannot simply be an observation of natural law, of what nature tells us is true. It has to also be reflected in our legislation and our law. And so I think if you put those things together, you see what I'm kind of trying to establish as the basis of a different economics of ending the injustice of racism. And so I hope that you're able to kind of make those comparisons as we kind of move forward. Thank you.